They describe guitar amps as warm,
Correct.
as compared to, and warmth is a dynamic word. A lot of measurements have been made over the years to try and explain what people think is the reason. And I discredit a lot of those because a very wise guy once said to me, there's a lot of things that you can measure that don't matter, and there's a lot of things that matter that you can't measure. And that applies to the phenomenon of why people like tubes. The usual explanation is that they have a second-order harmonic distortion, and transistors have an odd-order harmonic distortion. That would be the octaves and the way it's, and so they sound out of balance when you hear a transistor distort versus a tube. However, the tube microphones we use in recording, the tube preamps we use in recording, many of the tube guitar amps played like a twin reverb. You listen to Jimi Hendrix playing, a lot of his stuff was done on a twin reverb. Very clean sounds, not always distorted. So, and in fact, most guitar players, have a clean mode and a distortion mode that they'll use during the song. So if there's no distortion, then the form of distortion doesn't really explain the issue. And I think the other thing that people would commonly say is that tubes have a limited, they're a softer, rounder top end or this or that. Now, I don't think any of that's true. Like, once again, the best microphones that we seek out are old tube mics like this AKG C47 up here. It's a C12, stereo version of a C12, or the Neumann U47. The microphones everybody's copying today are tube mics. And they're copying because of their clarity. And really, the third part of sound, and we always talk about sound in the two easy forms to describe. One is frequency response. Oh, it's got more bass or less bass or more treble, or it's flat. That means it has equal amounts of everything. Or we talk about it in terms of distortion, which is it has, as the signal goes up, it begins to clip or distort. And of course, tube amps, we like the way they do that. But then again, if we're comparing them apples to apples, where they're in a clean mode, like a microphone or a guitar amp before it's turned up, what is it we like about tubes? Well, it's described in pretty much the third aspect of audio, which I think is the most important and the least talked about, and that's the dynamic aspect of it, the way it goes from top to bottom, the way a cymbal sounds, the way a pluck of a guitar string sounds, those things, the way a drum sounds on an overhead tube mic. The dynamic realism of tubes is what sets it apart from transistors. Transistors tend to hit the wall and there's no dynamic realism in it, whereas a tube completely goes up and down. You feel the full magnitude, I call it the front to back, the dynamic range of the sound. And in recording and in the world of recording, I could even make a case for that, the third part of audio, which is the dynamic characteristic. As we have gotten better with measuring things with computers today, we have fast Fourier analysis, ways of measuring things that are that fast. And we could always measure frequency response really easy, and we could, look at any speaker chart, look at any frequency response chart on a microphone. We could always measure distortion pretty easy. Just turn it up until the signal starts to act out, and then we see distortion characteristics, total THD, total harmonic distortion. But it wasn't until really recent years that we had equipment that was sensitive enough and quick enough, computer-based actually, to measure dynamic distortion. And it turns out, as they measure tubes and transistors, that transistors are loaded with dynamic distortions, anomalies that happen with that transient that don't happen in a tube circuit. So I like to talk about the whole evolution of tubes and the kind of rebirth of tubes in the recording industry. We originally recorded on wire many years ago, monaural, back in the days of Les Paul. Wire recording was pretty much, and prior to that, prior to World War II, was magnetic wire. It was monaural. If you listen to the old Django Reinhardt tapes and stuff, you'll be hearing stuff that was recorded on wire. We advanced to tape. Still hadn't gone stereo until really the early 50s, before we had actually two channels. We were still on tape, still had pretty much all the signal chain from the microphone to the cutting head on the record player was tube-based. And then along came the transistor. And we were still using tape recorders, and they got better. They had more channels. We went to stereo multi-track recording with many, many tracks recorded, mixed down to mono or stereo, using bigger pieces of tape and better magnetics, still on tape. And the transistor revolution came along. The Neumann U47 became the U87. Actually, it was a 67 in between, but pretty much the AKG 414 came out of the C12, this microphone. Same capsules, different electronics in the microphones. And transistors had a lot of advantages. They were lighter, they were cheaper, at least at that time. Weighed less, they required less support. You didn't need a power supply with them. They were measurably better in noise, which was a factor. Not so much so in frequency response, not so much so in distortion, because again, we weren't really looking for distortion, but they did have lower distortion numbers that were lower but still not audible in a tube amp, but they could measure better, as we say. And so engineers flocked to solid-state gear. They had solid-state microphones basically replace tube microphones while we were still using tape. That's a really important feature to understand, because when digital recording came along and tape was replaced, it's replaced today for all practical purposes. We don't use tape. Even video devices don't use tape much anymore. They've gone to solid state. The biggest single advantage of the hard disk recording, whether that be done originally on 8-track tape, ADATs, hard disk day, the biggest single advantage of digital recording was in a very much expanded dynamic range. There's an old saying that tape saturates. Oh, we like that saturation of tape. Well, what that really means is it's not giving you dynamic range. It's compressing to some degree. And when we got dynamic recording devices like ADATs and some of the early digital recording devices, and today
And that's like mid-90s, correct?
Yeah. Well, actually, digital recording started in the late 80s, and it became, I would say, it became commercially successful. With the first real commercially successful was the ADAT, and I'm not really sure when that came out, but my guess would be the 90s, yes. Either very early 90s or the late 80s. And that made an 8-track tape that could be recorded on a deck that was a couple of $1,000s versus some of the stuff that was out there that was astronomically priced. But it was used in the better studios. But regardless to the format, how many bits you cut it, whatever you want to call it, as digital recording has advanced from its early to late stage, it had a huge dynamic range advantage over tape. And the reason that's significant, and I don't want to get lost in that discussion, the reason that's significant for tubes and transistors is the first thing that happened as an observation was that people said digital recording was cold and harsh. And the solution was to pull out that old tube mic and plug it in. Oh, wow, that's warm. That's the solution. Digital recording is cold and harsh, but if you use a tube microphone or a tube preamplifier, that harshness goes away. And they were attributing the difference to the medium, the tape versus the hard disk. And a lot of people, of course, stayed with tape because, well, it sounds better, and they were, to some degree, right. But that expanded dynamic range of digital recording gave us an observation window to listen to what was going on in all those new solid-state mics and all those new solid-state preamps. And all of a sudden, what was masked before by tape saturation was exposed by hard disk recording.